Welcome back. This session is going to be a mixture of both theory and a bit of lab session. So as we know, we now have a pipeline which is robust and production ready, which is great. And we have been saying we need to schedule the pipeline to run every day and expect to receive the file within 24 hours. Let's see how to do that in Data Factory. Data Factory provides the scheduling ability in the form of triggers. You can create triggers and attach them to pipelines so that the pipelines are triggered as specified in the trigger. There are 4 types of triggers in ADF at the moment. The first one is schedule triggers, and then you've got tumbling window triggers and storage event-based triggers, and last we have custom event triggers. Let's have a look at each one of them to understand in a bit more detail. Schedule triggers are basically scheduled to run on a calendar. So if you're familiar with creating meetings in Microsoft Outlook or any other calendar application, you would immediately understand it. This trigger works exactly in the same way. It supports periodic and specific times. The time doesn't have to be at regular intervals. For example, it can be 1 a.m. and 10 a.m. every day. You can have many relationships in triggers and pipelines. For example, you can attach all your ingestion pipelines to one trigger and that link work all the pipelines at the same time every day. Similarly, you can invoke the same pipeline from more than one trigger. For example, you might want to run a database maintenance pipeline during ingestion as well as transformation. If that's the case, you can attach the maintenance pipeline to both of the triggers, which are your ingestion and the transformation triggers. The schedule triggers can only be scheduled to start in the future. You can't run them for a past day or a time, and also it doesn't make sense to do it that way. And for that you've got tumbling window triggers. Tumbling window triggers can only be scheduled to run at periodic interval from a specified time. Tumbling window triggers are a series of fixed-size, non-overlapping, and continuous time intervals. They're very useful when dealing with slices of data. For example, you have a requirement to ingest data from a SQL database into our data lake every hour, and we only want to ingest the data created during that hour. You can attach the pipeline to the tumbling window trigger, and that will invoke the pipeline every hour and pass the window start and the end time to the copy activity, which can then use those times to fetch the data for that particular slice. You can schedule a tumbling window trigger to run for a past date, as we said before. So if you want to ingest or process data for a previous slice, you just need to run that slice. So for example, you want to get the data from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. yesterday. You just run that slice and it'll fetch the data that got created during that period. Due to the fact that they are tightly coupled with pipelines, you can only have one trigger for a pipeline and vice versa. At first, you might be thinking that you could do everything the tumbling window trigger does with a schedule trigger, but there are significant differences. And we've covered a few here. I'll walk you through the rest when we look at the tumbling window trigger in Data Factory. The next one is storage event-based triggers. They are very simple to explain. They run pipelines in response to storage-based events such as the arrival or a deletion of a file in a blob storage or a data lake storage. Similar to scheduled triggers, you can have many pipelines attached to one trigger and vice versa. Next we have custom event trigger. Custom event trigger can be used for webhook integration, message queue processing, file system monitoring, external system events, and we can use it with scheduled jobs as well. So that is brief explanation about the 4 types of triggers. Hope that's given you an understanding about the types of triggers available within Data Factory and their uses. Let's switch over to the Data Factory and see them in action. Okay, here we are in the Data Factory. Click on the last icon on the top left, which is Manage. And then here you can click on Triggers to create a new trigger and then click on New. So as we said before, we got the 4 types of triggers listed here, and the default is the schedule trigger. So let's talk about the schedule trigger first. So as we said before, you can have the schedule trigger to start a specific time. Here you can set the start date. You are also having option to choose time zone. For my case, it is showing this time zone. So it means that you will set up the schedule as per specific time zone. With this setting in place, it means that this trigger will run on every 4:32 p.m. Indian timing, which is starting from April 21st, 2024. So here you can set the recurrence. So in this case it says 15 minutes, but you can go hours, days, weeks, and months. And you can have a no-end date, where you can set it to end on a particular day as well. So that's everything about the schedule trigger, but tumbling window trigger is a bit more involved. So as we said before, tumbling window trigger have to happen at a regular interval. So you got a start date, like the schedule trigger. You can even pick a start date, which is in the past. So let's pick 11th of April, and if we wanted it to run every day, at interval of 15 minutes. And then hours similar to the schedule trigger, you can say end date or you can leave as no end date. But the key things which are indifferent are here. So you can add a dependency. So you can make this trigger dependent on another trigger if you have created one of them. It accepts at the moment up to 2 triggers that you can make this trigger dependent on. And you can set a delay. So if you set your trigger to run every day at midnight, but you don't want it to start for half an hour after that, you can just put 30 minutes here and you can have concurrencies. So you can have a tumbling window trigger running concurrently. So you can have as many instances as you want it to be. And retry policy, you can have a trigger to retry itself. So in case of failure, it can retry itself at an interval you specify here. And that's everything about the tumbling window trigger. Let's now talk about the storage-based event trigger. As we said before, event trigger fires on creation of our deletion of a blob. So we just have to pick the Azure subscription and the storage account name under which we want to check for the file creation or the deletion. And then you provide the container name here. Either you can pick it up from subscription, or if you don't have full access to the subscription, you can manually enter the blob details here. And then you specify the rest of the folder part and the file name here. You can say, actually I want a blob which is created with a name starting like this or ending like this. Or you can just give the full name here. And you specify here whether you want the trigger to fire on blob creation or deletion or both. And also you've got the option to ignore empty blobs. So that's everything about the storage event trigger. Next we have custom event trigger. Custom event triggers enable seamless integration with external systems by allowing data pipelines to be triggered based on events occurring outside of Azure Data Factory that you can configure with Event Grid. And we've covered all 4 of them. So on this note, I am stopping over here. See you in the next session.